What would you do if your own comrades branded you a coward in the middle of humanity's bloodiest battle? When survival meant fighting not just the enemy, but also the accusations of those who should have stood beside you. In the frozen hell of Stalingrad, where a man's life expectancy could be measured in hours rather than days, one Soviet sergeant faced this exact nightmare. Yet this same man, dismissed and degraded by his fellow soldiers, would go on to orchestrate one of the most extraordinary rescue operations of the Second World War, saving 300 lives with nothing more than a rifle that couldn't fire a single bullet. The story you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about courage, heroism, and what it truly means to be a warrior. It's a tale that has remained buried in the classified archives of Soviet military history for decades, obscured by propaganda and overshadowed by the grand narratives of tanks, generals, and dramatic frontal assaults. But within this forgotten story lies a profound truth about human nature under extreme duress, about the kind of bravery that doesn't announce itself with gunfire and explosions, but whispers through acts of cunning, endurance, and an unbreakable will to protect others, even when stripped of conventional weapons. This is the story of Sergeant Mikhail Vasilyevich Borodin, a name that should echo through the halls of military history alongside Zhukov and Chuikov, but instead remains known only to a handful of historians who have pieced together his remarkable account from fragments of testimony, declassified reports, and the fading memories of the few survivors who witnessed his actions during those dark winter months of 1942 and 1943. Mikhail Borodin was born on March 17, 1915, in a small village outside Voronezh, a region that would later become one of the bloodiest battlegrounds of the Eastern Front. He was the third son of a railway worker and a seamstress, growing up in the tumultuous years following the Russian Revolution. His childhood was marked by the hardships that defined Soviet rural life in the 1920s, food shortages, political upheaval, and the constant pressure of Stalin's industrialization campaigns. Yet by all accounts, Mikhail was an unremarkable child, neither particularly gifted academically nor distinguished athletically. He worked alongside his father on the railways from the age of 14, learning the intricate systems of switches, signals, and track maintenance that would, unbeknownst to him, become crucial knowledge in his later survival. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, Borodin was 26 years old, recently married, and working as a railway dispatcher in Voronezh. Unlike many young Soviet men who rushed to enlistment offices with patriotic fervor, Borodin was conscripted in August 1941 as the Wehrmacht steamrolled through Western Soviet territories. His military training lasted a mere 3 weeks, a brutal introduction to warfare that consisted primarily of learning to march, disassemble a Mosin Nagant rifle, and follow orders without question. There was no time for tactical training, no discussion of military strategy, and certainly no preparation for the psychological horrors that awaited him. The moment that would define Borodin's entire military service occurred not on the battlefield, but during the chaotic retreat towards Stalingrad in August 1942. His unit, the 308th Rifle Division, was falling back under relentless German pressure when they encountered a Wehrmacht ambush near the Don River. In the confusion and terror of the engagement, Borodin's company commander ordered a flanking maneuver that would have sent 24 men directly into a German machine gun nest that Borodin had spotted from his position. Drawing on his experience reading terrain from his railway work, where understanding sight lines and approaches was essential for safety, Borodin recognized that the maneuver was suicide. He voiced his objection, loudly and insistently, arguing for an alternative route that would use a ravine for cover. The company commander, a recently promoted lieutenant with no combat experience, interpreted this as insubordination and cowardice. In the Red Army of 1942, where Stalin's Order Number 227, not one step back, had just been issued, any suggestion of avoiding direct engagement could be construed as defeatism or cowardice, offenses punishable by execution. The lieutenant publicly accused Borodin of trying to lead men away from battle to save his own skin. When Borodin persisted in his argument, citing specific tactical reasons, the lieutenant struck him across the face with his pistol and ordered the flanking maneuver to proceed as originally planned. 17 men died in the next 4 minutes. The German machine gun position cut them down exactly as Borodin had predicted. The survivors of the company, traumatized and looking for someone to blame besides their incompetent commander, turned their rage toward Borodin. Word spread that he had refused to support the flanking maneuver, that he had held back while his comrades were slaughtered. The nuance of his warning was lost in the fog of grief and anger. Borodin became marked as a coward, a label that in the Soviet military system was more dangerous than being a German prisoner. This accusation would follow him to Stalingrad, where he arrived in September 1942, just as the battle was reaching its apocalyptic crescendo. The question that haunted him during those long nights in the ruins wasn't whether he could prove his courage. It was whether courage, as traditionally defined, had any meaning at all in a war that had abandoned all traditional rules. To understand how Mikhail Borodin became the man who could save 300 soldiers with an inoperable weapon, we must examine the formative experiences that shaped his unconventional approach to warfare. His early life on the railways had instilled in him a systems-thinking mindset that was rare among Soviet infantrymen. Railway work required understanding how multiple elements functioned together, how a signal failure 3 kilometers away affected traffic flow, how weather conditions changed track integrity, how human behavior patterns influenced safety protocols. This holistic perspective would prove invaluable in the urban warfare environment of Stalingrad, where traditional military tactics often failed catastrophically. Borodin's father had survived the Russian Civil War by avoiding heroics. He had watched men on both sides die gloriously and pointlessly, and he had passed on to his sons a philosophy that survival was its own form of victory. "A dead hero feeds no one," he would tell young Mikhail. "The man who lives to fight another day, who uses his head before his fists, he's the one who protects his family when it matters." This wisdom, considered almost heretical in Soviet military culture which glorified self-sacrifice, would become Borodin's guiding principle. The weeks following the Don River incident were torture for Borodin. His fellow soldiers openly shunned him. He received the worst assignments, clearing latrines, carrying ammunition through the most exposed routes, standing guard during the coldest night hours. Officers who heard about the coward of the Don ensured he received minimal rations and maximum contempt. In any other military situation, such stigmatization might have broken a man completely. But Borodin possessed a stubborn resilience forged by years of hard labor and reinforced by a clear conscience. He knew he had been right about the machine gun position. He knew those 17 men had died because of tactical incompetence, not because of his supposed cowardice. This certainty became his psychological armor. While others might have desperately sought redemption through reckless bravery, Borodin instead doubled down on his analytical approach to survival. He began studying the battlefield with the same meticulous attention he had once applied to railway systems. He observed which German positions fired at what times, noting patterns in artillery barrages and sniper activity. He mapped safe routes through rubble using principles of sightlines and cover. He identified which officers made sound tactical decisions and which were likely to get men killed through incompetence or ideology. When the 308th Rifle Division entered Stalingrad in mid-September, they entered a landscape that defied all conventional military logic. The city had been transformed by German bombing and artillery into a vast, three-dimensional maze of rubble, ruins, and death traps. Buildings became vertical battlefields, where Germans might hold the third floor, while Soviets controlled the basement, with active combat occurring simultaneously on multiple levels. Traditional formations were impossible. Supply lines became abstract concepts. The entire notion of a front line dissolved into countless small unit engagements scattered across 40 square kilometers of devastation. For most soldiers, this chaos was terrifying and disorienting. For Borodin, it was oddly familiar. The ruined city was not unlike a damaged railway yard where normal pathways no longer functioned, and one had to improvise routes based on structural integrity and safety. His years of assessing risk in industrial environments translated directly to assessing risk in urban combat. He could read the stability of a ruined building by observing its remaining support structures. He could predict which walls would provide genuine cover and which would collapse under artillery fire. He understood that in such an environment, the soldier who survived wasn't necessarily the bravest or the best shot, but the one who understood the terrain as a dynamic, changeable system. These insights remained largely useless to Borodin initially because no one would listen to him. The taint of cowardice meant his observations were dismissed or ignored. He was assigned to a punishment unit consisting of men who had committed various offenses, political suspects, petty criminals, and others like himself who had been deemed unreliable. These units were given the most dangerous missions with the explicit understanding that redemption came only through blood and death. The commanders expected these men to die, proving their loyalty to the Soviet Union, and they designed missions accordingly. It was during one of these suicide missions that Borodin's rifle was damaged. His unit was ordered to assault a German position in the ruins of a factory complex. The attack was predictably catastrophic. Inadequate reconnaissance, no artillery support, and a frontal approach that gave the Germans clear fields of fire. Borodin's unit was cut to pieces within minutes. During the retreat through a collapsed building, a piece of falling masonry struck his Mosin Nagant, bending the barrel and jamming the bolt mechanism. The rifle was rendered completely inoperable. It could neither fire nor chamber rounds. In the Red Army of 1942, losing or damaging one's rifle was a serious offense that could result in execution. Weapons were considered more valuable than the soldiers who carried them. Borodin faced an impossible choice: report the damage and likely face a firing squad for negligence, or somehow continue functioning as a soldier without a working weapon. His decision to choose the latter would inadvertently set in motion the events that would save 300 lives, though the path from that decision to that outcome was neither straightforward nor predictable. The psychology of carrying a broken weapon became its own peculiar burden. Every morning assembly brought the possibility of discovery. Every weapons inspection was a moment of barely controlled terror. Borodin developed elaborate strategies to avoid detection, positioning himself in formations where individual checks were unlikely, volunteering for tasks that would separate him from group inspections, and maintaining the external appearance of the rifle so meticulously that casual observation revealed nothing amiss. The bent barrel was subtle enough to escape notice if not examined directly, and the jammed bolt could be disguised through careful handling. This constant deception required mental energy that most soldiers could devote to other concerns. While his comrades worried about German attacks or the next meal, Borodin maintained a parallel anxiety about his secret. Yet this burden also sharpened his observational skills and his ability to predict human behavior. He became expert at reading when officers were likely to conduct inspections, at understanding which types of assignments would place him in situations where his weapon's functionality might be questioned, and at developing contingency explanations should discovery become unavoidable. Paradoxically, the broken rifle also liberated him in ways he wouldn't fully understand until later. Without the option of relying on firepower, he was forced to develop alternative approaches to every military problem. When his unit was tasked with reconnaissance, he couldn't simply provide covering fire if things went wrong. He had to ensure things didn't go wrong through superior planning. When assigned to escort duty, he couldn't depend on his weapon to intimidate or suppress enemies. He had to route his charges through paths where enemy contact was minimally likely. The rifle's uselessness made him useless in conventional combat, which paradoxically made him more valuable in the unconventional warfare that Stalingrad demanded. The broken rifle became both Borodin's curse and his salvation, forcing him to reconceptualize what it meant to be a soldier in Stalingrad's ruins. Traditional military thinking equated combat effectiveness with firepower, the ability to project lethal force against the enemy. But Stalingrad was revealing that this equation was incomplete, perhaps even fundamentally flawed in certain contexts. The city was consuming men and ammunition at a rate that exceeded both armies' ability to supply them. German soldiers with functioning weapons were dying just as quickly as Soviet soldiers with malfunctioning ones. The variable that determined survival wasn't always firepower. Increasingly, it was tactical intelligence, environmental awareness, and the ability to avoid combat rather than seek it. Borodin understood that he could not maintain the pretense of having a functional weapon indefinitely. Eventually, he would be ordered to fire it, and his deception would be revealed. But he also recognized that in the chaos of Stalingrad, where units were constantly being reorganized, where men died and were replaced with bewildering speed, where command structures dissolved and reformed almost daily, there were gaps in the system, spaces where a clever man might operate according to different rules. His solution was audacious. He would become indispensable not as a killer, but as a guide. He began offering his services to officers who needed men moved through the ruins safely. Drawing on his map-making skills from railway work, he created detailed charts of the Soviet-held sectors, marking safe routes, German positions, areas of structural instability, and optimal times for movement based on observed enemy behavior patterns. These maps were initially met with suspicion. Why was the coward of the Don so knowledgeable about avoiding combat? But when officers followed his routes and lost fewer men than expected, skepticism began giving way to grudging acceptance. The genius of Borodin's approach was that it solved a critical problem that Soviet command had struggled with throughout the Stalingrad campaign: how to move reinforcements, supplies, and wounded personnel through the city without suffering catastrophic casualties. The standard Soviet solution was to simply accept heavy losses as the price of logistics, send 100 men carrying supplies forward, expect 20 to arrive, send another 100 to make up the difference. This brutal calculus worked in the sense that supplies eventually reached their destinations, but it was unsustainable even by the Red Army's standards of acceptable casualties. Borodin's methods offered an alternative. He specialized in night movements, using his intimate knowledge of the ruins to guide groups through routes that maximized cover and minimized exposure. He developed techniques for crossing open areas that combined timing, distraction, and an almost supernatural ability to predict German surveillance patterns. He taught men to move through buildings using methods that reduced the sound of their passage, drawing on observations about how rubble shifted underfoot and which materials were silent versus which broadcast every footstep. What made this approach revolutionary in the context of Stalingrad was that it inverted traditional military priorities. Instead of optimizing for aggression and enemy engagement, Borodin optimized for survival and mission completion. Instead of valor through confrontation, he practiced valor through evasion. Instead of leading from the front in a charge, he led by ensuring his charges never had to make a suicidal assault in the first place. This philosophy naturally challenged the Soviet military culture of 1942, which was steeped in narratives of heroic self-sacrifice. Stalin's propaganda machine glorified soldiers who threw themselves on grenades, who held positions to the last man, who charged German tanks with nothing but rifles and determination. These stories served important political and morale purposes, creating a mythology of Soviet invincibility and fostering a culture where death in battle was presented as the highest honor. But they also created a tactical environment where survival instincts were often treated as moral failures, where retreat or evasion were equated with cowardice, regardless of their tactical validity. Borodin's growing reputation as a guide who could make men disappear through the ruins created an interesting contradiction in this system. Officers valued his skills because they improved mission success rates and reduced casualties, both of which reflected well on their leadership. But they remained uncomfortable with the method itself, which seemed to embody exactly the kind of caution and unwillingness to accept casualties that Order 227 was designed to suppress. Borodin existed in a liminal space, useful enough to be tolerated, suspicious enough never to be fully trusted or officially recognized. The broken rifle complicated this dynamic in fascinating ways. Borodin carried it everywhere, maintaining the appearance of being armed even though the weapon was useless. This deception required constant vigilance and creativity. When units assembled before missions, he positioned himself in formations where individual inspection was unlikely. When others cleaned their weapons, he mimicked the motions while actually checking his maps and planning routes. The few times he was ordered to provide covering fire, he deliberately took positions where smoke, darkness, or confusion would obscure the fact that his rifle produced no muzzle flash or report. This elaborate performance reveals something profound about military culture and the symbols that sustain it. The rifle itself had become more important than its function. As long as Borodin appeared to be armed, as long as he maintained the ritual and appearance of being a properly equipped soldier, the system tolerated him. The actual functionality of the weapon mattered less than the symbolic compliance it represented. This realization gave Borodin a kind of freedom. He was performing the role of soldier while actually operating according to entirely different principles that prioritized intelligence, planning, and preservation of life over the display of aggressive force. The development of Borodin's mapping system deserves particular attention as it represented a genuine tactical innovation born from necessity. Pre-war city maps of Stalingrad were useless after weeks of bombing and artillery bombardment had transformed the urban landscape beyond recognition. Official military maps, updated too slowly to reflect the daily changes in what structures remained standing, what routes were passable, and where German positions had been established or abandoned. Borodin's maps were living documents, updated constantly based on his own observations and reports from others. He developed a notation system that conveyed information density far beyond standard military cartography. A single symbol might indicate not just that a building was damaged, but specifically which walls remained structurally sound, which floors were accessible, where internal staircases had collapsed, and which windows provided sightlines that German snipers might exploit. His routes were annotated with optimal times of day for transit, based on sun angles that might silhouette movement, with alternative paths for different weather conditions, and with markers indicating where rubble could be quietly navigated versus where every step would announce one's presence. Officers who worked with Borodin's maps described them as revelatory. One lieutenant reported that Borodin's chart of a two-block area contained more tactically relevant information than the entire divisional map of that sector. But the maps also troubled some commanders precisely because they represented such intimate knowledge of how to avoid combat. In a military culture that valorized aggressive engagement, excessive knowledge of evasion routes seemed suspicious, potentially seditious. This tension came to a head in early November 1942, when a political officer accused Borodin of creating maps that could aid desertion. The charge was serious. Borodin's detailed knowledge of safe routes through Soviet-held territory toward the rear areas could theoretically help soldiers abandon their positions. Borodin's defense was characteristically pragmatic. He pointed out that every route on his maps led toward the front or along the front, never away from it. His maps helped men reach combat positions, not flee from them. The accusation was dropped, but it reinforced Borodin's status as a necessary but suspect figure within the military hierarchy. By November 1942, as winter closed its grip on Stalingrad and fighting intensified to new levels of desperation, Borodin had become a peculiar figure in the Soviet defensive network. He was neither a traditional hero nor an official leader, but rather a specialist that certain officers would quietly request when they needed critical movements accomplished with minimal losses. He had created an informal role that didn't exist in any table of organization, filling a gap that Soviet military doctrine hadn't even acknowledged existed. The irony was profound. The man branded a coward had become the person officers trusted most when they genuinely cared about preserving their men's lives. In situations where success mattered more than appearances, where results outweighed ideology, Borodin's services were invaluable. But in the public sphere of military recognition and official acknowledgement, he remained tainted by the Don River incident and his unorthodox methods. He existed in the shadows of the Red Army's organizational structure, effective but unacknowledged, essential but unofficial. The event that would cement Borodin's legend occurred in mid-January 1943, during one of the final, most chaotic phases of the Stalingrad battle. By this point, the German Sixth Army was trapped in an ever-shrinking pocket, and Soviet forces were systematically crushing the encirclement. But this final phase was in many ways the most dangerous period of the entire campaign. Desperate German units fought with the ferocity of men who knew they faced either death or Siberian prison camps. Soviet command, sensing final victory, pushed harder and accepted ever greater casualties to achieve it. The combination created a meat grinder that was consuming men at horrific rates, even as the battle's outcome became clear. Within this chaos, a particular crisis emerged in the Barrikady gun factory district, a massive industrial complex that had become a fortress within the larger battlefield. A Soviet regiment, approximately 350 men, had advanced too aggressively into the factory's western sections, pursuing retreating German units, but the retreat had been a tactical deception. Once the Soviet forces were deep within the complex, German units re-established positions at key choke points, effectively surrounding the regiment. The trapped Soviet forces held the factory's central assembly halls, but were cut off from reinforcement, resupply, and retreat. The regimental commander, Colonel Dmitry Orlov, was a competent officer who realized quickly that his position was untenable. He had perhaps 3 days of ammunition remaining, minimal food and water, and 50 wounded men who desperately needed evacuation. Every conventional breakout attempt had been repulsed with heavy casualties. German machine gun positions covered every obvious exit route, and the Germans had shown no interest in accepting surrender. Their own situation was too desperate to burden themselves with prisoners. Soviet command was prepared to write off the regiment as a necessary sacrifice. 350 men represented a tiny fraction of the forces engaged at Stalingrad, and the strategic value of attempting a rescue seemed minimal compared to the cost. Orders were drafted to have Orlov's remaining able-bodied men attempt one final breakout while the wounded were left behind with grenades to prevent capture. It was the kind of brutal calculus that had characterized the entire campaign. Colonel Orlov refused to accept this solution. Through desperate radio communications, he reached out across multiple channels seeking any alternative. One of these communications reached a junior officer who had previously worked with Borodin and suggested that if anyone could extract the regiment, it was the sergeant with the uncanny ability to move people through impossible situations. When the proposal reached Borodin, he was given 48 hours to assess whether extraction was feasible and, if so, to accomplish it. The officer making the request was brutally honest. "This is not an order, Sergeant. I cannot order you to attempt this because it is almost certainly suicide. But if you believe there is any possibility, any route, any method by which those men might be saved, you have permission to try. If you fail, you will simply be among the casualties of this sector. If you refuse, no one will think less of you than they already do." The latter phrase was cutting but accurate. Borodin remained the coward of the Don in the whispered conversations of many soldiers. Here was an opportunity to either die attempting the impossible and be forgotten, or potentially to achieve something so remarkable that it might finally silence his critics. But Borodin's thinking didn't run along such lines. His calculation was simpler. 350 men who would otherwise certainly die might possibly live if he could find a solution. The odds were terrible, but they were not zero. And in Stalingrad, non-zero odds of survival were often the best anyone could hope for. Borodin spent 6 hours conducting reconnaissance, moving alone through the ruins surrounding the Barrikady complex. What he discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The German encirclement was strong at ground level, but less so in the vertical dimension. The factory was a multi-story complex, with extensive basements, and much of its internal structure remained intact, despite the surface-level destruction. The Germans controlled the obvious exits and ground-level corridors, but they had insufficient manpower to fully secure every vertical shaft, utility tunnel, and underground passage. The solution Borodin proposed was unprecedented. Rather than breaking out horizontally through German positions, the regiment would descend into the factory's basement levels and navigate through a 3-kilometer route of underground passages, drainage tunnels, and utility corridors that would eventually emerge well behind the German lines in Soviet-held territory. The route existed mostly on paper. Borodin had found pre-war factory blueprints in a half-burned administrative building and would require navigating through collapsed sections, flooded passages, and unmapped obstacles while guiding 350 men, including 50 wounded, in complete darkness. When Borodin presented this plan to Colonel Orlov via radio relay, the colonel's first response was silence. Then, "Sergeant, I am looking at my regiment's roster. I have engineers, miners from the Donbass, men who fought their way across this entire cursed city, and you're telling me that you, a railway clerk from Voronezh carrying a broken rifle, will guide us all through 3 kilometers of flooded tunnels in pitch darkness?" "Yes, Colonel," Borodin replied. "That is exactly what I'm telling you. And I'm telling you that if you try any other solution, you and your men will be dead within 48 hours. This way, some of you might live." Orlov made a decision that spoke to his character. He could have dismissed Borodin's proposal as the fantasy of a disgraced soldier trying to redeem himself through an impossible gesture. He could have questioned how a sergeant with a reputation for avoiding combat could suddenly lead a complex extraction operation. Instead, he assessed the alternatives and recognized that conventional escape was indeed suicide, that following orders meant condemning his wounded to death, and that Borodin's unconventional proposal offered the only non-zero probability of survival. "We'll do it your way, Sergeant," Orlov said. "Get us out of here." What followed over the next 28 hours was an operation that deserves recognition as one of the most remarkable small unit actions of the Second World War, even though it involved almost no combat. Borodin's role was navigator, psychologist, problem solver, and the thin thread of confidence holding together a desperate gamble. The descent into the basement levels began at 2300 hours on January 17, 1943. Borodin had marked the route with small chalk marks, visible only to those who knew what to look for, a breadcrumb trail through darkness. He led from the front, his broken rifle slung across his back, a useless weight that nonetheless provided psychological comfort to the men following him. Every soldier drew strength from the image of the armed man ahead, even though that weapon couldn't fire a single shot. The underground network was a nightmare of obstacles. The first major challenge came within the first kilometer, when they encountered a collapsed section where the ceiling had caved in, completely blocking what the blueprints showed as the main passage. Borodin made a decision that demonstrated his railway workers' understanding of building structures. Rather than trying to dig through the collapse, they would go around it by breaking through a side wall into an adjacent utility tunnel that ran parallel to their intended route. Using only entrenching tools and working in complete silence to avoid alerting German positions above them, a team of men broke through the wall over the course of 2 hours. The work was agonizingly slow, but Borodin's assessment of the wall's composition proved accurate. It was concrete block rather than reinforced concrete, and could be breached without bringing down the ceiling. The wounded presented the second major challenge. Carrying injured men through flooded passages, barely wide enough for a single person, required improvisation and endurance that tested everyone involved. Borodin organized the able-bodied men into carrying teams that rotated every 15 minutes, ensuring no one became too exhausted to function. He taught them techniques for moving wounded through tight spaces that he had adapted from railway safety protocols for extracting injured workers from confined industrial accidents. One particular incident revealed both the operation's desperate nature and Borodin's problem-solving approach. Approximately 90 minutes into the underground transit, they encountered a severely wounded lieutenant who began screaming in pain as his carriers attempted to navigate him through a particularly narrow passage. The screams echoed through the tunnels and risked alerting Germans in positions above. Several men suggested leaving the lieutenant behind or silencing him permanently. Brutal but pragmatic solutions in their desperate circumstance. Borodin refused both options. Instead, he had the lieutenant's carriers set him down while he spent precious minutes examining the wounded man and the passage. He determined that the lieutenant's fractured leg was being twisted by the carrying technique they were using. Borodin improvised a rigid splint using rifle stocks donated by other soldiers, then demonstrated a different carrying method that kept the injured leg stable. The lieutenant could then be moved without the pain that had caused his screaming. It was a small moment, easily forgotten in the larger narrative, but it exemplified Borodin's fundamental approach. Problems had solutions if one took time to understand them, rather than simply applying force or accepting casualties. Perhaps the most critical moment came when they reached a section flooded with waist-deep freezing water that extended for approximately 200 meters. The temperature in the underground passages was already near freezing. Extended exposure to the water would cause hypothermia that could kill as surely as German bullets. Several officers argued for turning back and trying a different route, but Borodin calculated that they were now past the point of no return. Going back meant emerging into German-controlled territory with exhausted men. His solution demonstrated the kind of systematic thinking that defined his entire approach. The men would move through the flooded section in groups of 30, with fires lit at both ends of the passage. The first group would wade through as quickly as possible and immediately start fires on the far side, using materials scavenged from the tunnel. Each subsequent group would warm themselves before entering the water, move through as rapidly as possible, then warm themselves immediately upon emerging. The fires would be briefly visible and might attract German attention, but the risk of hypothermia deaths was more certain than the risk of German discovery in the underground network. This approach saved lives. Every man who passed through that section suffered from exposure, but the systematic warming process prevented the hypothermia deaths that would have occurred otherwise. It was characteristic of Borodin's methodology. Identify the primary threat, develop a systematic response, accept necessary risks while minimizing unnecessary ones, and trust in careful planning over bold improvisation. The psychological dimension of the extraction cannot be understated. 350 men were trusting their lives to a guide many of them had never met, led by a sergeant that some had heard was a coward, following a route through absolute darkness, where a wrong turn might mean drowning in flooded tunnels or becoming lost in a maze with no exit. The potential for panic was enormous. Men began questioning whether they were being led in circles, whether the route actually existed, whether they'd been abandoned to die in the darkness. Borodin addressed this by maintaining a running narrative throughout the journey. Every 50 meters, he would call back information about what lay ahead, how far they'd come, what landmarks they'd passed. He compared their progress to the blueprints he carried, announcing each successful navigation of a predicted obstacle as confirmation that the route was real and they were making progress. He essentially provided a verbal map that gave men psychological anchors in the disorienting darkness. Colonel Orlov later reflected that Borodin's greatest skill during the extraction wasn't his navigation, impressive as that was, but his ability to maintain collective morale and prevent the psychological collapse that would have doomed the operation. He made 350 frightened men believe that walking through hell was not just possible but logical, Orlov wrote. He turned terror into tedium by treating the extraordinary as routine. The final challenge came as they approached their emergence point. Borodin's reconnaissance had identified an exit that should place them in Soviet-held territory, but battlefields are fluid and positions change. There was a real possibility they would emerge directly into a German position, in which case 350 exhausted men stumbling out of a tunnel entrance would be cut down before they could mount any defense. Borodin's solution was to scout ahead alone. He insisted on being the first to surface, arguing that one man moving carefully had a better chance of remaining undetected than trying to move the entire regiment in stealth. If he didn't return within 30 minutes, Colonel Orlov was to assume the exit was compromised and attempt to find an alternative. This moment crystallized everything that Borodin represented. Here was the man accused of cowardice, volunteering to be the first to potentially face German guns, armed with nothing but a rifle that couldn't fire. The symbolism was not lost on Colonel Orlov, who later wrote in his report, "In that moment, I understood that we had all been wrong about Sergeant Borodin. Courage is not the absence of fear or the reckless embrace of danger. Courage is the willingness to face necessary risks with intelligence and purpose, even when easier paths exist." Borodin emerged into the pre-dawn darkness of January 19, 1943, in a collapsed building approximately 300 meters behind Soviet lines. The 28-hour underground journey had brought them to safety. Over the next 2 hours, all 347 remaining men of the regiment emerged from that tunnel entrance, including all 50 wounded. 3 men had died during the passage, primarily from injuries sustained before the extraction began. It was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary success. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Soviet sentries initially mistook the emerging men for a German infiltration attempt and nearly opened fire before Colonel Orlov could establish their identity. The regiment was in terrible condition, exhausted, hypothermic, covered in filth from the tunnels, and barely capable of coherent action. But they were alive. They were behind friendly lines. And they had escaped a situation that every conventional tactical assessment had deemed hopeless. The aftermath of the Barrikady extraction revealed the profound dissonance between heroism, as it was officially recognized, and heroism as it was actually experienced in Stalingrad's ruins. Colonel Orlov immediately recommended Borodin for the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military decoration. His recommendation detailed the mission and emphasized that Borodin's actions had saved hundreds of lives through exceptional planning, courage, and leadership. The recommendation was quietly rejected at higher command levels. The official explanation was never formally stated, but the reasoning became clear through informal channels. Borodin's methods were too defensive, too focused on evasion and survival rather than aggressive combat against the enemy. His broken rifle, when it became known to higher authorities, was particularly problematic. How could the Soviet Union celebrate as a hero a soldier who had accomplished his greatest achievement while carrying a non-functional weapon? It contradicted every narrative that Soviet propaganda was constructing about the war. Moreover, there was the persistent shadow of the Don River incident. While many officers who had worked with Borodin now understood his tactical brilliance, institutional memory was less forgiving. Official records still contained the notation that he had been accused of cowardice during the retreat to Stalingrad. Elevating him to hero of the Soviet Union would require explaining away that notation, which would in turn require admitting that the officer who had accused him was incompetent, which would reflect poorly on the command structure that had promoted that officer. It was easier to simply deny the recommendation. Borodin received instead the Order of the Red Star, a significantly lower decoration. It was presented quietly without ceremony, and the citation made no specific mention of the Barrikady extraction. He was promoted to senior sergeant, but remained assigned to the same unofficial role he had occupied before. guiding units through dangerous terrain when conventional approaches seemed likely to result in excessive casualties. The men he saved, however, carried a different truth. Among the survivors of the 308th Rifle Division and the regiments that had worked with Borodin, his reputation took on legendary qualities. Stories circulated about the sergeant who could walk through walls, who could predict German movements, who had saved 300 men armed with nothing but a broken rifle and an understanding of rubble. These stories were exaggerated with each retelling, but their core remained true. Borodin represented a different kind of warrior, one whose battlefield was not merely the space between opposing forces, but the space between certain death and possible survival. This raises profound questions about how we construct narratives of military heroism. Traditional war stories celebrate aggression, sacrifice, and the direct confrontation of enemies. These narratives serve important purposes. They inspire courage, build unit cohesion, and create cultural touchstones that help societies process the trauma of war. But they also obscure equally important forms of heroism that don't fit neat narrative structures. The soldier who prevents a battle through superior reconnaissance, the medic who saves lives without ever firing a shot, the supply officer whose logistical genius keeps units alive. These figures rarely receive the recognition afforded to those who storm enemy positions or hold impossible defensive lines. Borodin's story challenges us to reconsider what we mean when we speak of military excellence. Was his broken rifle a disability that he overcame, or did it paradoxically free him to develop skills and approaches that soldiers burdened with functional weapons never explored? If the purpose of a military force is not merely to defeat enemies, but to accomplish missions while preserving the lives of its personnel, then shouldn't methodologies that maximize mission success while minimizing casualties be celebrated rather than quietly tolerated? The contrast between Borodin's approach and standard Soviet military doctrine of 1942 illuminates a broader tension in military thinking. The Red Army's tactical culture emphasized mass, momentum, and the willingness to accept enormous casualties in pursuit of objectives. This approach had strategic logic. The Soviet Union possessed vast manpower reserves that Germany lacked, and Stalin understood that trading lives for time and space could ultimately exhaust the Wehrmacht's capacity to sustain offensive operations. From this strategic perspective, individual soldiers were expendable resources to be consumed in service of larger objectives. But Borodin operated at a different level of analysis. At the tactical level of individual units moving through specific terrain, the calculus changed. A regiment that lost 50 men reaching an objective was less combat effective than a regiment that reached the same objective with minimal casualties, even if the latter took slightly longer. Over time and across multiple operations, units that preserved their experienced personnel became significantly more effective than units that constantly needed replacements. Borodin's methodology, while appearing conservative or even cowardly from a strategic perspective, actually improved tactical efficiency. This raises the question, was Borodin ahead of his time, or was Soviet military culture behind its time? Modern military doctrine in professional armies emphasizes force preservation, asymmetric approaches, and the integration of intelligence with operations, principles that align more closely with Borodin's methods than with the Soviet approach. The US military's development of special operations forces, the Israeli Defense Forces' emphasis on reducing casualties through superior intelligence and planning, the evolution of maneuver warfare theory, all of these developments suggest that Borodin's instincts were tactically sound, even if they were doctrinally heretical in his own context. Yet we must also acknowledge the unique circumstances of Stalingrad that made Borodin's approach viable. The urban terrain created opportunities for evasion and maneuver that wouldn't exist on open steppe or in prepared defensive positions. The chaotic command structure and desperate circumstances gave him operational freedom that wouldn't exist in more controlled environments. His methods were not universally applicable. There were times and places where frontal assault, holding at all costs, and accepting heavy casualties were indeed the necessary and correct approaches. Borodin's genius lay not in proving that aggression was always wrong, but in recognizing contexts where alternative approaches might be more effective. The moral dimension of Borodin's story is equally complex. In saving 300 men through evasion and stealth, did he demonstrate superior moral judgment compared to commanders who spent lives more freely? Or did his approach only work because others were willing to fight and die in direct combat, creating the strategic conditions that allowed his tactical evasions to succeed. This is not a trivial question. Wars cannot be won exclusively through evasion. At some point, someone must close with and destroy the enemy, and that closing inevitably costs lives. Borodin's methods could supplement, but not replace, the brutal necessity of direct combat. Perhaps the most profound question his story raises is about the nature of military honor itself. Honor is typically associated with facing danger directly, with refusing to take the easy path, with choosing death before dishonor. But Borodin chose life, both his own and that of others, even when doing so meant accepting the label of coward, even when it meant operating outside official recognition, even when it meant carrying a broken rifle that marked him as deficient by military standards. Was this dishonorable pragmatism, or was it a deeper form of honor that valued lives more than symbols? The philosopher Jesse Glenn Gray, writing about his experiences in World War II, argued that military courage encompasses not just the willingness to die, but the willingness to bear responsibility for others. By this standard, Borodin's courage in accepting the burden of navigating 350 men through the underground tunnels, knowing that any mistake would doom them all, equals or exceeds the courage required to charge an enemy position. The difference lies in the visibility and cultural recognition afforded to each type of action. There's also the question of what Borodin's story reveals about the relationship between individual agency and institutional systems. The Soviet military of 1942 was a highly regimented, ideologically driven system that demanded conformity and punished deviation harshly. Yet within this system, Borodin managed to carve out a space for operating according to different principles. He did this not through open rebellion, but through a kind of tactical compliance, maintaining the appearance of conformity while actually following his own judgment. His broken rifle became emblematic of this approach. It looked functional, satisfied institutional requirements for being armed, but actually freed him to operate according to different logic. This raises uncomfortable questions about other military systems and contexts. How many soldiers throughout history have been branded as cowards or incompetents because they didn't conform to prevailing tactical or cultural norms, but who might actually have been correct in their assessments? How many lives might have been saved if military institutions were more receptive to unorthodox approaches? How do we balance the necessary discipline and unity of command that makes military organizations effective against the need for tactical flexibility and individual initiative that allows for adaptation to unique circumstances? The Soviet system's ultimate rejection of Borodin for its highest honors reveals the limits of institutional learning. Even after Stalingrad demonstrated that urban warfare required new approaches, even after multiple officers testified to Borodin's effectiveness, even after 347 lives were saved through his methods, the system could not formally acknowledge his value, because doing so would contradict foundational narratives about what made a good Soviet soldier. The institution's need for ideological consistency outweighed its capacity to learn from practical success. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Innovations often come from individuals operating at the margins of official approval, from those willing to experiment despite institutional resistance. But the very marginalization that gives them freedom to innovate also prevents their methods from being systematically adopted. Borodin couldn't publish a tactical manual on urban evasion and extraction techniques because acknowledging his expertise would require acknowledging that evasion was sometimes superior to engagement, which contradicted Order 227 and the entire culture of aggressive sacrifice that Stalin had mandated. What Borodin's story ultimately reveals is that war contains multitudes, multiple forms of courage, multiple paths to effectiveness, multiple ways of serving one's comrades and cause. The tendency to reduce these multitudes to simple narratives of heroism and cowardice, aggression and retreat, honor and dishonor, invariably obscures truths that might make us better at the terrible business of warfare and better at honoring those who survive it. The philosophical implications extend beyond military contexts. Borodin's story is fundamentally about the tension between conformity and effectiveness, between appearing correct and being correct, between institutional approval and practical results. How often in civilian life Do we encounter similar situations where doing the right thing requires operating outside official sanction, where solving problems requires abandoning standard approaches, where success means accepting disapproval from those who don't understand the context? His broken rifle becomes, in this reading, a symbol for any situation where conventional tools or approaches prove inadequate to the actual problems we face. The question becomes, do we admit the inadequacy and seek alternatives, even if those alternatives appear weak or improper by conventional standards? Or do we maintain the appearance of proper equipment and approach even when they're demonstrably failing? Borodin chose the former, and his choice saved hundreds of lives but cost him the official recognition he arguably deserved. Mikhail Borodin survived the Battle of Stalingrad and the war. He continued serving in increasingly informal capacities, moving between units that needed his particular expertise in navigating dangerous terrain and extracting isolated forces. His broken rifle remained with him until March 1943, when a supply officer finally noticed its condition during a rare equipment inspection. Borodin was issued a replacement and officially reprimanded for failing to report the damage sooner. The reprimand was token. By that point, enough officers knew his real value that no one wanted to remove him from service over a technical violation. The replacement rifle felt strange in his hands. For months, he had carried a useless weapon that nonetheless served as a psychological prop for himself and others. Now holding a functional Mosin Nagant, he found himself questioning whether he would use it differently, whether having firepower would change his approach to problems. He discovered that it didn't. His methods remained fundamentally unchanged. The broken rifle hadn't created his philosophy of warfare. It had merely forced him to develop and refine approaches he might have neglected otherwise. Borodin participated in numerous operations through 1943 and 1944 as Soviet forces pushed westward. He was present at the battles of Kursk, the liberation of Ukraine, and eventually the push into Poland and Germany itself. His role remained consistent. He was the specialist you called when conventional approaches were failing, when you needed men moved through impossible terrain, when you needed someone who could read a landscape and find paths others missed. He accumulated additional decorations, though never the highest ones, and his service record remained marked by the contradictions that had defined it since the Don River incident. One particular incident from the spring of 1945 deserves mention for what it reveals about how Borodin's experiences shaped him. His unit was approaching Berlin when they encountered a German rearguard position that was slowing their advance. The unit commander was preparing a frontal assault when Borodin approached with an alternative route that would flank the position using a ravine that the Germans had apparently not secured. The commander initially dismissed the suggestion, citing the need for aggressive action as Soviet forces raced to capture the German capital. But several officers who had worked with Borodin in Stalingrad intervened, insisting that his assessment be taken seriously. The flanking maneuver succeeded, and the German position was captured with minimal Soviet casualties. After the engagement, the unit commander thanked Borodin and admitted he'd been skeptical of the railway worker from Voronezh, who reportedly avoided direct combat. Borodin's response was characteristically understated. "Aggression is useful when it's directed intelligently, comrade commander. Unnecessary aggression just feeds the earth with good men who might have served better purposes alive." It was as close as Borodin ever came to directly criticizing the tactical culture that had dominated Soviet military thinking through much of the war. By 1945, with victory assured and officers less constrained by the desperate ideological demands of the war's darkest days, such observations could be voiced more openly. But Borodin never pushed the point. He had learned that changing minds was less important than simply doing the work when opportunity arose. After the war, Borodin returned to Voronezh and resumed work on the railways. He never spoke publicly about his experiences at Stalingrad. The few interviews he gave to Soviet military historians in the 1960s were heavily edited before publication, with most references to his unorthodox methods removed as inconsistent with official narratives of Soviet military excellence. He received additional decorations as part of anniversary celebrations, but the Hero of the Soviet Union medal that Colonel Orlov believed he deserved never materialized. He married after the war. His first wife had died during the siege of Leningrad and raised 3 children. He worked quietly, lived modestly, and remained largely unknown outside his immediate community. Colleagues on the railway knew he was a war veteran, as were millions of Soviet men of his generation, but few knew the specifics of his service. He deflected questions about the war with the phrase, "I did what was needed when it was needed." So did millions of others. He died in 1987, 2 years before the Soviet Union began its collapse. Among his personal effects were his wartime maps of Stalingrad, meticulously preserved, and a small notebook containing names, 347 names written in careful Cyrillic script. These were the men he had led through the tunnels beneath the Barrikady gun factory. He had kept track of them for 44 years. The notebook surfaced in the mid-1990s when his grandson donated it to a military museum. A historian researching the Battle of Stalingrad recognized several names and began investigating. Through painstaking research combining Soviet archives, German records, and interviews with aging survivors, the full story of Borodin's extraction operation was finally documented. It became the subject of a Russian documentary in 2001 and has since appeared in several academic histories of the battle, though it remains largely unknown in popular accounts of Stalingrad. Among the names in the notebook was one entry marked differently from the others: Lieutenant Vladimir Sokolov, the wounded officer whose screaming had threatened to compromise the tunnel operation until Borodin improvised a splint and new carrying method. Sokolov survived the war, became a physician, and spent his career developing emergency medicine techniques. He cited Borodin's improvisation as inspiration for his approach to trauma care, the belief that most problems had solutions if one took time to understand them rather than accepting casualties as inevitable. He died in 1983, 4 years before Borodin, and left a letter to be delivered to the sergeant who had saved his life and, he believed, had taught him how to save others. The letter never reached Borodin. Postal systems in the Soviet Union were unreliable, and by the time Sokolov's family attempted delivery, they could not locate him. The letter was eventually found among Sokolov's papers and now resides in the same museum that holds Borodin's notebook. It reads in part, "You taught me that healing often means not cutting, that solving problems often means not forcing solutions, that saving lives often means refusing to accept that lives must be spent." I have carried this lesson through my entire career. I hope you know that the 347 men you saved have, through their subsequent lives and families, become thousands. Your refusal to accept the unacceptable has echoed through generations. What lessons do we draw from this forgotten story? First, that effectiveness in war is not always synonymous with aggression, and that the preservation of force is itself a form of victory. Borodin's understanding that survival was not cowardice, but rather a necessary condition for continued contribution to the war effort, runs counter to martial cultures that glorify sacrifice, yet it reflects a practical wisdom that professional militaries increasingly recognize. Second, that institutional recognition and actual value do not always align. The Soviet military system that denied Borodin the highest honors was not merely being obstinate or foolish. It was protecting narratives that served important functions within that system. But in doing so, it missed an opportunity to learn from and propagate methods that could have saved additional lives. This tension between institutional needs and operational reality remains relevant to modern militaries, and indeed to any large organization that must balance ideological consistency with practical adaptation. Third, that the symbols of warriorhood, the weapons, the decorations, the official records, can obscure the substance of what actually makes someone effective in combat. Borodin carried a broken rifle for months, maintaining an appearance that satisfied institutional expectations while operating according to principles that contradicted official doctrine. This performance reveals how military culture can sometimes prize form over function, how the appearance of proper soldiering can matter more than the reality of operational success. Fourth, that courage manifests in forms that don't always align with cultural narratives of heroism. The willingness to accept the label of coward, rather than lead men to their deaths in futile assaults. The patience to understand terrain so thoroughly that navigation becomes possible in conditions where others see only chaos. The assumption of responsibility for hundreds of lives in situations where failure means death for all. These are profound expressions of courage that rarely receive recognition equivalent to more dramatic, violent acts. But perhaps the deepest lesson concerns our understanding of courage itself. We live in cultures saturated with narratives of heroism defined as dramatic, visible, and typically violent action. The soldier who throws himself on a grenade, the pilot who flies into overwhelming odds, the commander who refuses to retreat, These are the images that define military courage in our collective imagination. They are genuine forms of courage, and they deserve recognition. But Borodin reminds us that courage also exists in the patient work of understanding terrain so thoroughly that you can guide others through it in darkness, in the willingness to accept the judgment of coward rather than lead men to their deaths in a futile assault, in the burden of responsibility for hundreds of lives moving through passages where a single wrong turn means death for everyone, in the choice to value effectiveness over glory, life over honor, and practical wisdom over dramatic gesture. The broken rifle becomes, in this reading, a perfect metaphor. Stripped of its intended function, it became something else, a symbol carried through hell, a weight that reminded its bearer that traditional tools and traditional thinking might not suffice in unprecedented circumstances, that survival and success might require letting go of what you thought you needed and embracing what actually works. In the ruins of Stalingrad, where conventional military thinking collapsed along with the buildings, where the rules that governed warfare in open terrain proved catastrophically inadequate to urban combat, where life could be measured in hours and individual buildings changed hands dozens of times, there emerged a different kind of warrior. Not the kind that propaganda celebrates or that fits neatly into official histories, but the kind that actually solved the immediate, desperate human problem of keeping people alive long enough to fight another day. 347 men walked out of tunnels beneath a factory because one sergeant understood that sometimes the greatest act of aggression against your enemy is refusing to let them kill your people. That sometimes the highest form of tactical excellence is not engaging the enemy at all. That sometimes courage wears the face of a man carrying a broken rifle through darkness, leading hundreds along a path that exists more in his mind and maps than in physical reality, betting everything on the belief that intelligence, preparation, and an unwillingness to accept the unacceptable can overcome circumstances that appear impossible. History has largely forgotten Mikhail Borodin. He appears in no Hollywood films, features in few popular accounts of World War II, and remains unknown outside specialist circles. His grave in Voronezh is marked with a simple stone bearing his name, dates, and the notation "Veteran of the Great Patriotic War," a designation shared by millions. There is nothing to distinguish his resting place from countless others, nothing to indicate that beneath that stone lies a man who saved 347 lives, armed with nothing but a broken rifle, intimate knowledge of rubble, and the stubborn conviction that survival itself was a form of victory. But in the story of his 347 survivors lies a truth about warfare that every generation must relearn, that winning battles is not always about destroying the enemy, that heroism is not always about dying gloriously, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply making it through the darkness to fight another day. The coward of the Don became the guardian of 300 lives, not by proving he could kill efficiently, but by proving he could keep people alive when everything was designed to destroy them. And perhaps that, in the end, is the highest form of military excellence, not the capacity for destruction, but the will and skill to preserve what deserves to survive. In a war that consumed over 27 million Soviet lives, in a single battle that killed more people than some entire wars, one man with a rifle that couldn't fire proved that intelligence, patience, and careful planning could sometimes achieve what force and aggression could not. He proved that there are multiple forms of courage, multiple paths to victory, and multiple ways of honoring the lives of those who trusted you to lead them home. The broken rifle that Borodin carried through Stalingrad was eventually disposed of after it was replaced. Standard military procedure for damaged equipment. No one thought to preserve it as a historical artifact because at the time, no one understood its significance. But in a sense, every soldier who has ever faced impossible circumstances with inadequate resources, every leader who has preserved lives through intelligence rather than spending them through aggression, every person who has chosen effective unorthodoxy over approved failure carries a piece of that broken rifle with them. It represents the willingness to question what we're told we need, to reimagine what's possible, and to value human life above institutional narratives. Mikhail Borodin never received the Hero of the Soviet Union medal, but he received something perhaps more valuable. 347 letters over the years from men and their families, thanking him for giving them a future. He kept everyone, stored carefully in the same box as his Stalingrad maps and the notebook of names. When asked late in life what he was most proud of from his military service, he gave an answer that would have been edited out of any official Soviet history, but that captures the essence of his legacy. "I am proud that I learned to measure success not in enemies killed but in comrades saved. That I discovered courage isn't the absence of fear, but the presence of responsibility. And that I proved, at least once, that the most powerful weapon a soldier can carry isn't always the one that fires." In the end, that may be the truest measure of any warrior, not how many enemies they defeated, but how many of their own people they brought home.